through. Let's go on to it.
Thank you. There's a story behind this presentation. I was going to be the discussant for this panel, and then about a week ago I was promoted, and I thought, what can I do with that image? What could I do that sort of is interesting? And I thought I'd flesh out an idea that's been in my head for a while. And in fact, I'm really glad that Ruth showed it's the Wilton diptych, isn't it, which is the Richard II picture you showed. Because what interests me in this presentation is how works of art can provide an image of political power and political institutions, which undoubtedly that image does. But the thing that really triggered me to think about this a bit more was that there were not one, but two really quite high-profile plays on in London last year that dealt with aspects of British government and the Constitution. And I'll talk about those plays and I'll introduce them to you in a second. But what really struck me as interesting is that this has happened at this moment in time. Because I think you can make a very good case that this is a moment of extreme constitutional instability in the United Kingdom. I mean, Anthony King, who's a scholar of British constitutionalism, used the very academic term in a recent book to describe the British Constitution as a mess. But if one thinks about the kind of debates that we're having at the moment about independence for Scotland, whether to be in the European Union, whether it's possible for a party to construct a single governing majority, a single party to do that, or whether the party system is in freefall with the rise of extreme parties or outsider parties. Recent votes on whether we should change the electoral system or not. Or indeed just the simple level of distrust that the public seem to have in lawmakers, politicians and the political process, perhaps best embodied in the recent expenses scandal. It struck me as really interesting that these two plays were, at this particular moment, getting very, very strong critical reviews and playing to sell out audiences. Let me introduce the two plays to you for those of you who haven't seen them or aren't aware of them. So the first play was a play that was on at the National Theatre, running from last year and into this year as well, called This House. I'll show you the trailer that the NT put online. Do we have sound?
The best of British theatre in a cinema near you, proudly supported by Aviva. It's 1974 and Great Britain is in crisis. Minor strikes have crippled the country. The ruling party is holding on by a thread. The British nation is at breaking point.
One party governs, one party opposes. We're not built for cooperation, Michael. Our enemies, but they're slick and strong and weird. Well, look at this. This country has been kept alive on aspirin when what it needs is electric bloody shock therapy.
I've cancelled an operation twice now, a big one.
The lady is not at home, George. Try to act like honourable members of this house and not football hooligans. Everything on my face, huh?
This house will be broadcast live on the 16th of May. For more information, visit ntlive.com.
So this play deals with particularly the Whip's office during the mid to late 1970s, a period when we had very unstable government. It was very hard to form a governing majority, very similar to today, and there were a number of crises ongoing in British politics. The second play, The Audience, stars Helen Mirren, reprising a role she'd already played and won an Oscar for as the Queen. And this play deals with the weekly audience that the monarch has with the Prime Minister, and it traces the entire 60 years of her reign with various walk-on parts for Prime Ministers. Let me show you the trailer for that as well.
The meeting takes place in the private audience room located on the first floor of Buckingham Palace.
An unbroken line from Churchill to me.
Let's not forget that of the two of us, I am the one that came from a small street with nothing.
I never wanted to be ordinary.
Which made you consider you have failed in that ambition?
In this audience, Prime Ministers would fall on your spell.
So the argument I want to make to you today is that both plays actually, we recognise the arguments being made in them and the arguments being presented, and I would go as far as saying they actually echo, consciously or not, classical thinking on constitutional doctrine. But what they both ask, I think, as well, and this maybe is why they are plays of our time rather than historical plays, is they ask how does government and how do governing institutions cope with times of crisis and change. I think it's very hard to make the case that either play is radical in the sense that they push out an alternative constitutional doctrine or suggest that the Constitution requires radical reform. But what I would want to suggest to you also is there's quite a big difference between them in terms of the different ways they cast the Constitution. So the audience, the image of government presented is one that stresses continuity, and it echoes, and I'm going to make this argument to you, echoes Bagehot, who's the great Victorian constitutional theorist, argument that we should focus on what he calls the dignified parts of the Constitution, the monarchy being the most famous of those. In contrast, this House enters into a debate which is really about how a constitution copes with decay and the fallible human element that exists within it. And crucially, it highlights a question about whether the British Constitution is really suitable for coping with crisis, or whether it's ill-equipped to do that. And my reading of the play would be that it ultimately actually rejects more conservative readings of the Constitution. Both plays share a dramatic device, and this is a dramatic device which is actually, again, well established in the literature on constitutionalism, which is that they invite us into private places. Yeah. So whether this be the private audience between the monarch and the prime minister, or whether this be the party whip's offices, these are not parts of government we necessarily get access to. And I think this idea of going into secret places is very interesting. And indeed, it echoes a strong strand of literature, which is that we see the Constitution as somehow being secretive. Bagehot, again, if you read him, talks a lot about magic or secret or mystery in the Constitution. There's this wonderful quote which we could almost transpose to today rather wonderfully, which is, "We catch the Americans smiling at our Queen and her secret mystery, and our Prince of Wales was happy in action." And it's something he wrote in 1867, yet seems still very pertinent to us. More recently, Peter Hennessy has talked about the hidden wiring of the Constitution. And this is what these plays actually take us to, and show us these spaces that we don't normally get to see. But what I'd suggest is that the way the plays are staged creates quite a different relationship between the audience and this idea of hidden wiring. So I don't know if anyone actually saw this house at the theatre. Did you see it? Did you see it in the Cottesloe, or did you see it in the Olivier? Yeah. So because it was first on in the Cottesloe, which is the small studio theatre at the National, and they'd essentially built the whole theatre to replicate the House of Commons. They used this device somewhat in the Olivier, because they put seats on the stage where audience members were. But in the Cottesloe, it was actually an all-enveloping experience. So essentially, the audience has a feeling that they are supposed to be in this secret place. They are, if you like, they become complicit in the process of government and crisis. And I think this is a very interesting device. In contrast, in the audience, while we are allowed to peer in to these meetings, we are almost presented as unwelcome guests. And there's there is a dramatic device where a child version of the Queen, who makes various appearances, sort of with nervousness about her fate, knowing that she's going to become the monarch, actually peers at the audience as if she's peering through a window at Buckingham Palace, but then retreats because she doesn't want to be seen by passers-by. So the idea is, we're kind of not supposed to be here. So there's a very different presentation of this. Another thing I think that's interesting as well is in the audience what you find is these politicians are familiar to us, yes? So again, if you've seen Helen Mirren with Michael Sheen doing the Tony Blair and the Queen, these are recognisable caricatures or performances based on real people, and various leaders appear in this way. Whereas in this house, all the characters are anonymised. They only refer to them by their constituency, not necessarily by their name. So, I mean, in that little video, you may have seen there's one sort of recognisable figure there, and that's Heseltine because of his haircut. But actually, most of the characters are relatively anonymous, and this is quite interesting. So you don't get, again, have this feeling that you're viewing celebrity from the outside, and I think this is a very interesting, dramatic device. So what I'm going to argue to you is that the audience offers a much more traditional, a Tory, if you like, or conservative response to political crisis. So again, this echoes Bagkop's reading of the Constitution and the monarchy, that in particular he argues that the monarchy is an essential part of the Constitution because it is dignified, or more to the point, it's a distraction. Yeah, so it allows the political classes to get on with governing the country, while the rituals of monarchy distract the population. And indeed, he says this explicitly, using rather lovely capital letters in the original text to say, it acts as a disguise. This is the purpose of the monarchy. And indeed, in the final monologue in the play, Elizabeth makes this clear. In other words, she says, you don't need to look to the monarchy to understand why the monarchy survived. Look to the prime ministers. We are useful to them. We are not an elected president who is going to meddle in their affairs, but rather we act as this distraction. And I think this is a really interesting and a very overt statement about how the Constitution may work. What's also, I noted, very interesting is the prime ministers who actually appear in the play. Not all of them do. And in fact, there are 4 omissions when you go through the cast list. Macmillan, Hume, Heath and Blair do not appear. And I think in this particular case, it's interesting because these last 2 are arguably the most constitutionally radical prime ministers of Elizabeth's reign. Heath is the prime minister who leads Britain into the European Union. Blair is the prime minister who introduces devolution. So these are the biggest constitutional changes probably of the period, and these are the characters who are not given a voice. I mean, Blair in particular is actually mocked in the play without appearing on stage. So this maybe leads to a sense, I think, that this is quite a constitutionally conservative play. In contrast, this house makes, I think, a different case and offers a debate about how we understand the Constitution. So one thing here is that there are a number of references to the fact that no one really understands where the Constitution comes from, that things go back into the mist of time, that there's a lot of gentlemen's agreements. And this echoes Sidney Lowe, actually, a lovely text on governance in 1904. He says, we live under a system of tacit understandings. The understandings themselves are not always understood. And this is something that is referenced explicitly in the play, and I think it's a rather lovely quote to explain where they're coming from. But then the question is raised, well, can this system of informal rules and agreements survive a moment of extreme crisis? So one view, which is kind of a Burkean view, if you like, or more recently Oakeshott, the great constitutional conservative, argued this, that essentially when you do have crises, they are but minor blips. The general path is a movement towards evolution and good governance. And that what we do is we improvise in these situations, we rely on conventions, and indeed, as the play says, we muddle through. But then there are other statements in the play which suggest this fundamentally doesn't work. And this is a big problem. So, for example, we are very reliant on the human element. I think it would all work fine, British democracy, if it weren't so damn reliant on people. Another point, that the system doesn't cope with any kind of cooperation. It's an oppositional system. But this doesn't work at a time of crisis when the nation is divided, as it was in the 1970s, arguably as it is today. So therefore, the central story of the play is about the human element failing, and in particular the fact that, and those of you who know your 1970s history will know what happened is gradually Labour MPs die, and their majority decreases, and some of them are ill and they can't make it to the lobby, and there are incidences of MPs turning up in ambulances on oxygen to go and vote to maintain the government's majority. But there are also metaphors in the play to suggest that this is contagious. It's not just human. It's in the fabric of the system. So there's a discussion of the Thames as being diseased. There's actually a reference also to a historic incident where Big Ben, the clock tower, actually broke down during this period of time. The only time it's been not working for a prolonged period of time was in 1976, during this period of chaotic government. And this is used as a metaphor to suggest the whole system is cracking up. So I would argue that ultimately this House rejects the Victorian Constitution. The failings might be down to the human element, but what's interesting is the system is so reliant on the human element that it becomes a system-wide failure. So as such, it almost overtly rejects Burke's argument that constitutions and governments should be based not on human reason, but on human nature. This is not a possible way of governing a country, is the case that's being made. So to conclude then, what I'd argue to you is that both plays are addressing crisis and the Constitution, and thus they are plays that offer something to us in contemporary debate at a moment of constitutional crisis. But what the audience offers is a fetishisation of the Victorian Constitution, suggesting that stability and continuity and service are the ways through moments of crisis. The relationship of the audience also suggests that we might think about social hierarchy as being important and something to maintain as well, which is an interesting argument and quite overtly made through the structuring of the play. In contrast, this House asks us to empathise with the MPs because they're working with a system that doesn't work, it's broken and it's unwieldy. And thus the argument can be extended to say that the system of government might actually be part of the problem. So the play doesn't necessarily advocate radical constitutional change, but what it does do is it rejects the Burkean reading that we can just rely on precedents and ideas that have existed since time immemorial as a way of governing a country at times of crisis.